"Let me cook for you tonight," she whispered. And that one sentence spoken by a girl no taller than a fence post to three mountain men who could have broken her in half changed everything that Shadow Creek Ranch had become. But before we get to that kitchen, before we get to the smell of fried chicken drifting through a house that had forgotten what hope tasted like, you need to understand what brought Rosalie Sinclair to the edge of the Colorado wilderness in the autumn of 1873, and why she almost didn't survive her first night. The stagecoach had been climbing for the better part of 2 hours, the horses laboring, the driver cursing under his breath at every switchback. Rosalie Sinclair had not spoken a word since they left the last town behind a place so small it barely had a name, just a trading post and a saloon and a livery stable where the horses had been changed. She had sat perfectly still the entire time, her hands folded over the leather trunk on her lap, her cornflower blue eyes fixed on the window, watching the world she knew shrink to nothing behind her. The mail coach lurched over a rut so deep it nearly threw Rose from her seat. She caught herself against the wooden frame, her small leather trunk sliding across her lap, and pressed her face closer to the window. Outside, the road narrowed to a ribbon of packed dirt climbing through pine forest so thick that the afternoon light barely touched the ground. The air smelled different up here, colder, sharper, like the mountains themselves were breathing. Rose had been traveling for 6 days. 6 days of dust, in bad roads and worse food, moving steadily west and then north from Denver into the San Juan Range, watching civilization thin out with every mile. She was 21 years old. She weighed barely 110 pounds. Everything she owned in the world fit inside the trunk on her lap. A few dresses, a handwritten cookbook that had belonged to her mother, a cameo brooch that was the last thing Eleanor Sinclair had ever touched, and a letter. The letter was an advertisement clipped from the Rocky Mountain News in a neat rectangle. Shadow Creek Ranch, San Juan Mountains, Colorado. Seeking honest, healthy woman with cooking skills, willing to build a family on the frontier. Reliable ranch owner with land and cattle. Contact S. Hawthorne. Rose had read those words at least 200 times since she had cut them from the paper. Each time the same question surfaced. What kind of woman travels 6 days into the wilderness to marry a man she has never met, the desperate kind? The kind with no family, no money, no home, and no one in the world who would notice if she vanished. Rose's mother had died of consumption when Rose was 14. Her little sister Emma, barely 3 years old, had died of fever, 2 years after that, burning up in Rose's arms, while the doctor shook his head and said there was nothing more to be done. Her father, Henry Sinclair, a brilliant accountant who had taught Rose to read ledgers before she could read books, drank himself into the grave before Rose turned 18. He left behind nothing but debts and a daughter who understood with terrible clarity that love was just another word for something you were going to lose. For 3 years after that, Rose had drifted. Kitchen to kitchen, logging camps in Oregon, gold mines in Nevada, cattle ranches across the plains of Texas. She cooked because it was the one thing she was good at, the one language she spoke fluently, the one skill that kept her fed and sheltered wherever she landed. But she never stayed, not once. Because staying meant building something. And building something meant caring about it, and caring about anything was just setting yourself up to watch it die. Until this advertisement. Something in those simple words had pulled at her like a hook in deep water. Not romance. Rose did not believe in romance. What pulled her was the word build. A family on the frontier. A place that needed her. And Rose Sinclair, who was terrified of needing anything, could never resist a place that needed her. The coach driver pulled his horses to a stop at the top of a steep grade and pointed down into the valley below. Shadow Creek Ranch, half a mile down. I don't go no further than this. Rose leaned forward and looked. The valley spread out beneath the late afternoon sun like a painting done in gold and rust. A large 2-story log cabin sat at its center, flanked by a big barn, cattle pens, a smokehouse, and a scattering of smaller buildings. Snow-capped peaks rose on 3 sides, closing the valley in like cupped hands. It should have been beautiful. And it was in the way that abandoned churches are beautiful, the bones of something that had once been loved, now slowly falling apart. Fences tilted at wrong angles. The barn roof sagged in the middle, paint peeled from shutters that hung crooked on their hinges. The whole place looked like it was holding its breath, waiting to die. "The Hawthorne brothers," the driver said as Rose climbed down her trunk, bumping against her hip. 3 of them, big as bears and twice as quiet. The oldest one, Silas, lost his wife some years back. Place has been more graveyard than ranch ever since. He looked Rose up and down this slap of a girl in her dusty navy blue dress with her little trunk and her cameo brooch and shook his head. Good luck, miss. You'll need it. The coach turned around. Red dust rose and settled. And Rose stood alone on a dirt road at the top of the world, looking down at the place where her new life or her newest disaster was waiting. She took a deep breath, gripped the handle of her trunk, and started walking down the hill. She reached the front yard of the ranch house, just as the sun touched the western peaks, flooding everything in amber light. She stopped at the gate and looked up at the porch. They were all three, standing there like statues carved from the same granite mountain behind them. Silas Hawthorne stood in the center, the tallest of the three, at 6 feet and 6 inches shoulders, as wide as a barn door, arms folded across a chest that looked like it had been built to stop bullets. His hat sat low over a face that could have been handsome if it had not been so hard that all sharp planes and shadows a jaw that looked like it had been set with cement. His eyes were the color of aged whiskey, and they held the same warmth as a January sky. He looked at Rose the way a man looks at a bill he cannot pay. To his left stood Gideon, 6'5", shirtless, despite the autumn chill, every muscle in his body visible and tensed like a bowstring about to snap. Sweat gleamed on his chest and arms in the fading light. A long scar ran diagonally across his left cheek from his ear to the corner of his jaw, giving his face the look of something that had been broken and badly repaired. His eyes, the same amber as his brother's, but hotter, angrier, stared at Rose with open hostility. A red bandana was knotted at his throat. An axe stood buried in a chopping stump beside him, its blade catching the last of the sun. To the right stood Caleb, the youngest at 6'4", his dark blonde hair falling across his forehead in a way that made him look barely old enough to shave. His hat was pushed back on his head, and he was the only one of the three whose face showed anything other than stone. He looked at Rose with a small, guilty, almost apologetic smile, a dimple appearing in his right cheek. But even that smile trembled under the weight of his brother's stares. Rose stood at the gate 5 feet 3 inches tall, holding a trunk that looked absurd against the scale of everything around her. The endless fields, the enormous mountains, the three enormous men. She swallowed hard, tightened her grip on the trunk handle, and walked through the gate. "I'm Rosalie Sinclair," she said, her voice clear, despite the fact that her heart was trying to beat its way out through her ribs. "I'm here about the advertisement." Silence. Wind moved through the valley, carrying the smell of pine and cattle. A horse whinnied somewhere in the barn. Silas stepped down from the porch. Each step made the boards groan under his weight. He stopped about 6 feet from Rose and looked down at her, the height difference so extreme that she had to tilt her head almost straight back to meet his eyes. "What advertisement?" Rose pulled the letter from her pocket and held it out. Silas took it. "Read it," and his face already hard turned to iron. He looked at Caleb. Caleb. One word, but the way he said it, soft and flat and terrifying, and made Rose take half a step backward. Caleb swallowed. "Silas, I can explain. You placed a bride advertisement in my name. Not a question. The ranch needs... What this ranch needs is my concern." Silas tore the letter in half and quarters and let the pieces fall into the red dust. Rose watched them drift down and felt her stomach go with them. "Miss Sinclair, I apologize for the inconvenience. My brother had no authority to..." "Silas," Gideon's voice cut in from the porch, sharp as an axe blade. "Send her away. The mail coach comes back Tuesday. She can wait in town." "Town is 20 miles from here," Caleb protested. "It's getting dark. You can't put her on the road at night." "That's not our problem." Gideon came down off the porch, each boot striking the steps like a hammer blow. He stopped beside Silas and stared down at Rose with eyes that could have set wet wood on fire. "Listen here, girl. Whatever my brother wrote in that advertisement, here's the truth. We don't need a bride, don't need a woman, don't need change. This ranch has survived 20 years without you, and it'll survive 20 more." Rose looked at Gideon, at the scar on his cheek, at the muscles coiled tight at his cable wire, at the fury burning in his eyes, and she saw something that neither of his brothers could see. Fear. Gideon was not angry at Rose. He was afraid of her, afraid of what she represented. Change, hope, the possibility of being hurt again. But Rose did not say that. Instead, she drew a breath and said, "Let me cook one dinner." All three brothers blinked. "What?" Silas said. "One dinner. Let me cook one meal for you and your men tonight. If nobody eats it, I'll leave before sunrise." No argument. Rose set her trunk on the ground and straightened her spine, only 5 feet 3 inches of her standing against a combined total of nearly 20 feet of mountain man. "I traveled 6 days to get here. At least give me the chance to prove I didn't waste the trip." "Let her into the kitchen." A new voice came from the far end of the porch. Rose turned and saw an old man sitting in a rocking chair smoking a pipe. His eyes narrowed to slits beneath a battered hat brim. Old Walt Briggs. Been 3 years since anyone cooked a proper meal in that kitchen. "Give the girl 3 hours. See what she can do." Silas looked at Walt. Walt looked back, unblinking pipe smoke drifting into the evening air. The silence stretched. 3 hours, Silas finally said. "Supper at 6. If the boys spit it out, you're gone." He turned his back and walked away without another word. Gideon held Rose's gaze for one more burning second, a look that said, "This isn't over," and followed his brother. Caleb rushed down the steps, his face flushed with shame. "I'm sorry, I didn't think it would—" "Where's the kitchen?" Rose cut him off, her voice steadier than she felt. "Through the back door, on the left. Take me there." The kitchen of Shadow Creek Ranch looked like a place where food had come to die. Rose stood in the doorway and breathed in rancid grease, burnt coffee, rotting wood, and something else she recognized but did not want to name. The smell of men who had given up, expecting anything good. Flour had crusted on every surface like old paint. The cast iron stove looked like it had not been properly cleaned since before the Civil War. Pots hung from hooks with rust eating through the handles. A layer of fossilized grease covered everything like a greasy shroud. The floor stuck to her shoes with every step. The windows were opaque with grime and evaporated cooking oil. Rose set her trunk on the only clean surface she could find and rolled up her sleeves. Caleb hovered in the doorway, turning his hat in his hands. "Bad, huh?" he asked. "Worst I've ever seen. And I've cooked in Oregon logging camps. Last time anyone really cooked in here was 3 years ago." Caleb's voice dropped. "Sarah, Silas's wife. She used to make this kitchen the best room in the house. Fresh bread every Sunday morning. Flowers on the table. White curtains. Laughter." He looked around the ruined room. "Then she died. Right here in this room. Fever took her in 3 days. Nobody could save her." Rose stopped scrubbing. "She died right here. They set up a cot right at where she was landing. Silas didn't leave this room for 3 days straight. After that, he never came into the kitchen unless he had to. Nobody dared cook here. We hired people. 4 or 5 came and tried. None lasted more than a week. Partly because Gideon ran them off. Partly because— Can you feel it? There's something in here. Not a ghost, just sadness. Sadness soaked into the walls. Rose could feel it, but she could feel something else too. Beneath the rancid grease and rotting wood, this kitchen had once been loved. The cast iron stove was the good kind, the kind that had been ordered special for someone who knew how to cook. The spice shelves were built with care, each slot sized perfectly for a single jar. The window frames were wide to let in light. Someone had designed this kitchen for a woman who loved to feed people. "Sarah designed this kitchen?" Rose asked softly. Caleb nodded, eyes red. "She drew the plans. Silas built every inch by hand." Rose unpinned her cameo brooch and placed it carefully inside her trunk. Her mother's keepsake would not be stained with grease. She pushed her sleeves higher. "Get me hot water, lots of it. And find the oldest hand on this ranch, someone who remembers what this kitchen used to have in it before everything fell apart." Rose attacked the kitchen the way a general attacks a battlefield. She started with the stove, scraping years of built-up grease into a bucket with a flat blade she found in a drawer. Her hands burned. She did not stop. Hot water, rags, scrub, repeat. Old Walt arrived smelling of horses and tobacco, squinting at her like she was a mirage. "Boy says you need to know the old stores. I need to know what's here, what's forgotten, what's still good." Walt scratched his beard. "Root cellars got potatoes, carrots, onions, if they haven't rotted. Smokehouse has beef bones. Boys don't bother with bones anymore, just want the cuts. Flour bins fresh, got that last week. Buttermilk in the coal box, but it might have turned. The buttermilk better not have turned. I need it. Walt studied her. You making fried chicken? If I can get this stove hot enough and find oil that isn't rancid. Something changed in the old man's weathered face. The creases around his eyes softened. Fried chicken, he murmured. Nobody's made fried chicken since. Since when? Since Sarah was alive. She used to make it every Sunday. Whole ranch smelled like heaven. Rose met his gaze. Then let's make it smell like heaven again. Walt stood still for a long moment. Then he turned and came back with Jedediah Thornton, a quiet man of 30 with careful hands and watchful eyes. This is Jed, best hand we've got with fire. He'll keep your stove running right. Within 30 minutes, the dead kitchen was crawling with life. Jed coaxed the stove into a roaring blaze. Caleb hauled water until his shirt was soaked through. Walt climbed into the attic and came back with 2 jars of dried peaches, dusty but intact, put up by the first Mrs. Hawthorne, the brothers' mother, years ago. Another hand brought vegetables up from the root cellar without a word. Rose worked like a woman possessed. She tested the buttermilk still good and set it aside with cracked black pepper and salt for the chicken brine. She sifted flour, found cornmeal, and started mixing batter for skillet cornbread. She sent Caleb to the smokehouse for every beef bone they had. Are we feeding an army? Caleb asked. No, we're feeding hungry men. There's a difference. While the bones roasted to release their marrow, Rose cut potatoes and carrots with a knife she had to sharpen herself. The blade sang against the whetstone. Her hands remembered rhythms from a dozen different kitchens, a dozen different lives before this one. She did not tell these cowboys that she had cooked in logging camps and mining towns, that she had fed railroad workers and ranch hands from Montana to the frontier towns of southern Texas. That food was the only language she had ever spoken fluently. You did not need to tell men your whole story, you just needed to feed them. The chicken went into the buttermilk brine. She dredged each piece through seasoned flour, black pepper salt, just a whisper of cayenne. The fat in the cast iron skillet hissed when the first piece went in, and the smell rolled through the kitchen like a promise kept after years of silence. Walt stopped in the doorway and just breathed. Lord Almighty, he whispered. Jed stood transfixed. I don't even know what that smells like. It smells like someone gives a damn, Rose said, flipping the chicken with tongs she'd found buried under a pile of rags. Now get out of my kitchen before you drip sweat in my food. They scattered. She worked alone then the way she preferred. Cornbread went into the cast iron skillet, the batter bubbling at the edges where it met the hot metal. Beef bones simmered in a pot large enough to bathe a child, slowly giving up everything good they had to offer. Onions, carrots, potatoes, salt, pepper. A bay leaf she found in a forgotten jar. The peach cobbler came last. Dried fruit soaked in hot water until it softened, then mixed with sugar cinnamon butter. She rolled out biscuit dough for the topping. Her hands moving without thought, muscle memory passed down through her fingers from her mother's hands. The sun had set when the kitchen door opened. Silas Hawthorne stood there. Behind him, 12 ranch hands gathered like a jury waiting to deliver a verdict. He looked around the transformed space, clean counters, organized shelves, pots steaming with purpose, and something shifted in his eyes. You had 3 hours, he said, and I used them. Rose had set the long table in the ranch dining room with plates she had found and scrubbed forks. She had polished cups she had cleaned until they gleamed. No fancy decorations, no flowers, just clean dishes and food that tasted like home. The cowboys filed in suspicious and silent. They sat down like men expecting poison. Rose brought the chicken out, first golden crispy, still crackling from the skillet. Then the cornbread dripping with honey she had found in the pantry. The beef stew in a serving bowl large enough to feed a battalion. The peach cobbler waited on the sideboard like a benediction. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Silas sat at the head of the table, his face unreadable. He looked at the fried chicken like it might bite him back. He looked at Rose like she had performed some kind of witchcraft. It's not going to eat itself, she said. Old Walt reached for the chicken first, his hand trembling. He took a piece, bit into it, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Sweet Jesus." That broke the dam. 12 men fell on the food like they had never seen a meal before. Chicken vanished. Cornbread disappeared in chunks. The stew emptied so fast that Rose barely had time to refill the bowl from the pot in the kitchen. Silas still had not touched his plate. Rose walked over and stood beside him. You said if the men rejected it, I'd leave. He picked up his fork, cut into the chicken. The crispy skin shattered. The meat inside was white and tender steaming. He took a bite. The room went quiet again, every man watching. Silas chewed slowly, swallowed, set his fork down. Then he picked it back up and took another bite. Eat, he said to his men, his voice rough as gravel. And for the first time in 3 years, Shadow Creek Ranch heard something it had forgotten existed. Laughter, Caleb told a joke about a mule. Walt argued with Jed about the best way to mend a fence. Emmett Corwin, a leather worker with rough hands and a quiet manner, asked for seconds, then thirds. The cobbler came out and grown men fought over the last spoonful like children at Christmas. Rose stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. This was why she cooked. Not for the food itself, but for this, the moment when people remembered they were more than just mouths to be fed. When a table became a gathering place instead of a trough. When a house started feeling like a home again. She watched Walt telling a story with both hands gesturing wildly while Jed shook his head in disagreement. She watched Caleb lean back in his chair, belly full, face open and young and happy for the first time since she had met him. She watched Emmett carefully cut a piece of cornbread and wrap it in his handkerchief to save for later, the habit of a man who had known real hunger and never fully trusted that the next meal would come. She watched the younger Hans boy, barely out of their teens, eating with the kind of focus that men reserve for things they are afraid might disappear. And she watched Silas. He had cleaned his plate without comment, without praise, without a single word directed at her. But twice she had caught him looking at the kitchen doorway where she stood, and something in his expression, not gratitude exactly, not affection, something older and sadder than either of those, had flickered like a candle in a drafty room before he looked away. For the first time since her mother died, Rose Sinclair felt the faint, terrifying stirring of belonging. She pushed it down immediately. Belonging was dangerous. Belonging meant you had something to lose. The triumph of that first dinner earned Rose a reprieve. 1 week. If things worked out, they would talk. If not, she would leave before dawn. Silas agreed not because he wanted to, but because Walt looked at him with an expression that said, "If you send her away, I quit." The second day started well. Breakfast was biscuits from scratch, bacon eggs scrambled with cheese and coffee strong enough to raise the dead. The Cowboys ate like wolves, louder than the day before, more comfortable with each other. Jed nodded at Rose across the table. "Mighty fine, ma'am. Save the compliments until you've tasted everything." "Don't need to taste it. I can tell by how old Walt's eyes got wet." "They did not," Walt protested through a mouthful of biscuit. "Did so. Saw you wipe your face. That was grease." But by the third evening, everything collapsed. Rose had run out of supplies. The kitchen did not hold enough food to sustain 15 people day after day, and Silas told her the next supply run to town was not until Saturday, 4 days away. Dinner was bone broth soup for the second time, with different vegetables but the same pot. Gideon spoke for the first time since Rose had arrived. "Same soup as last night." Rose met his eyes. "Same bones, different vegetables." "Problem. Just seems like a cook who talks big should offer more variety." "A cook with supplies offers variety. A cook working with scraps makes do. Or maybe you're not as good as you think." Gideon pushed his bowl away. The table went silent. "Gideon," Walt said, "that's enough." "Is it?" Gideon rose from his chair, the legs scraping against the floor like a warning. "We all got excited about fried chicken and cobbler. Now we're eating bone soup like paupers. I've had better meals on cattle drives." He turned to Silas. "I'm saying what everyone's thinking, brother. You brought in a mail-order bride to fix problems that can't be fixed with food. This ranch is dying. Has been since Sarah passed. Bringing in some catalog girl won't change that." "Catalog girl." Rose repeated the words softly, so softly that every man at the table leaned forward to hear. "You just called me a catalog girl." "I called you what you are. You were ordered, through the mail, like buying goods from the Sears catalog." Gideon stepped closer, the scar on his cheek gone white under the oil lamplight. "You don't belong here. You don't know us. Don't know this ranch. Don't know what we've lost." Silas stood. "Gideon, sit down." "I'm not sitting." Gideon looked around the table. "Who wants to tell the truth?" The ranch is dying, the bank is circling, we can't afford to feed the cattle, let alone another mouth. And you, he pointed straight at Silas. You're hiding inside your grief while everything falls apart around you. The silence was terrible. Silas and Gideon faced each other, two enormous men, same blood, same pain, handling it in two completely different ways. Silas with silence, Gideon with fire. Walk outside, Silas said, his voice so low it was barely a vibration. Cool down, then come back and apologize. I don't apologize for telling the truth. Gideon slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows on his way out. Rose felt her face burning. I'll leave in the morning. You'll do no such thing, Silas said without looking at her. He looked around the table. Anyone else want to leave doors open? But Rose stays the week we agreed. After that, it's her choice. One by one, the men went back to eating, but the damage was done. Rose retreated to the kitchen and gripped the edge of the counter. Fighting tears she refused to let fall. This was why she never stayed. This was why she kept moving. Because eventually they always turned on you, always blamed you for problems that existed long before you arrived. She had heard these same words in different mouths in logging camps and mining towns from bosses and foremen and trail cooks who had promised she was indispensable, right up until the moment they decided she was expendable. The worst part was that Gideon was not entirely wrong. The ranch was dying. She could see it in the sagging fences, in the empty stalls, in the way the men moved through their days with the exhausted patience of people waiting for a verdict they already know will go against them. No amount of fried chicken could fix a bank ledger that did not balance. No amount of cornbread could rebuild a herd lost to winter. Gideon had said the truth out loud, and the truth had teeth, and now everyone at that table was going to bed with bite marks. Rose pressed her forehead against the cool wood of the counter and breathed. In, out, in, out. The kitchen smelled like dishwater and grease and the fading ghost of peach cobbler. Somewhere outside, she could hear Gideon's boots on gravel pacing the restless movement of a man at war with himself. That night, Jed Thornton found her in the kitchen. He's scared, Jed said gently, standing in the doorway. Gideon, he's scared the ranch is dying. Scared of losing the only home he's known for 15 years. Scared that if we can't afford food, we can't afford him. That doesn't give him the right. No, but fear makes men cruel, you know that. Rose did know. She had seen it in logging camps and mining towns and kitchens from here to Montana. Fear and hunger made people vicious. I don't have enough food to last until Saturday, she said quietly. Jed smiled, and it was the first time Rose had seen him smile. You're not the only one who knows how to stretch a meal. My grandmother back in Kansas used to feed 12 people on 3 potatoes and a prayer. Let me show you. For 3 hours, Jed taught Rose techniques his grandmother had used during the hardest years, rendering every drop of fat soaking dried beans overnight, to double their size cutting flour with cornmeal to make it go further, turning vegetable scraps into stock. They worked in comfortable silence, and something shifted inside Rose. Maybe she was not alone in this after all. Thursday's breakfast was cornmeal mush with the last of the honey. Lunch was bean soup thick enough to stand a spoon in. Dinner was potato hash with bacon bits so small they were more memory than meat. Rose served each meal expecting revolt. The men ate. No complaints. Not one. She understood what was happening, and it humbled her in ways she had not expected. These men were not eating because the food was good. They were eating because someone had cooked it for them, because someone had stood over a hot stove at 4 in the morning and thought about what they might need to get through a day of brutal physical labor, because someone had cared enough to trun. That was the ingredient that had been missing from Shadow Creek Ranch for 3 years. Not skill, not supplies. Care. Simple, stubborn, unreasonable care for people who had forgotten they deserved it. Friday morning, when she served fried mush with sorghum syrup that Caleb had found at the back of the pantry, Walt told a story about his mother making the same thing during the Civil War. We ate it every day for 2 months, he said. Thought I'd never touch it again. But this, he took another bite. This tastes like she's right here in the room. Gideon did not appear at meals. Rose did not ask where he was. Friday evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Silas found her in the kitchen. It was the first time he had stayed in this room for longer than 30 seconds since his wife had died in it 3 years ago. He leaned against the counter, and Rose understood the weight of what that small gesture meant. Supply run tomorrow morning, he said. Need a list. Rose handed him 3 pages of carefully written items, quantities, estimated costs. Silas stared at the pages. Detailed. That's my job. Most cooks just holler out what they need. I'm not most cooks. He folded the pages and slipped them into his pocket. Then he was quiet for a long time, looking around the kitchen, seeing it not as it was now, but as it had been. And Rose knew that in his mind, he was standing in the same spot watching his wife die. My wife used to say that cooking was the last honest work left in the world, he said finally. You couldn't fake it, couldn't pretend. Food either nourished you or it didn't. She sounds like she was wise. Wise enough to marry me when I had nothing but this land and a dream. He met Rose's eyes and she saw it there beneath the granite, the grief that had calcified around his heart like scar tissue around a wound. She died in this room. Fever took her in 3 days. I couldn't save her. Couldn't do anything but watch her fade. He paused. Until you showed up. Now I walk in here and I smell food. Hear people eating. Feel like maybe this place isn't just a tomb I'm tending. Rose did not know what to say to that. Silas pushed away from the counter. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start fresh. He left and Rose stood alone in the kitchen that had belonged to a dead woman, feeling the weight of expectations she had never asked for. Saturday morning, Silas hitched the wagon and drove to town with Rose's supply list. And riding beside him, surprising everyone, was Gideon. While the brothers were gone, Caleb sat beside Rose on the porch steps and told her the truth. Cattle prices were down. Feed costs were crushing them. Last winter, they had lost half the herd to cold. The bank was circling, and Silas was too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to sell, too loyal to let anyone go, even when he could not afford to keep them. So why did you place the advertisement? Rose asked. Caleb looked at her with the warmest amber eyes of the 3 brothers, eyes that still believed good things were possible. Because I watched Silas dying a little more every day. Because this ranch needed something that 3 men couldn't create on their own. Because I remembered what it smelled like when Mama baked bread on Sunday mornings, and what laughter sounded like around the dinner table, and what it felt like to be a family instead of a work camp. He swallowed hard. I know I was wrong to deceive you. But watching these past few days, watching the boys laugh for the first time in 3 years, I can't say I regret it. Rose touched Caleb's hand gently the way an older sister might touch a younger brother's. You weren't wrong, Caleb. You were just reckless. That's the specialty of the youngest. He grinned, and for a moment he looked like the boy he still partly was, 23 years old, and carrying the weight of a family that was breaking apart around him. Rose, can I ask you something? Yes. Why did you come, really, not the advertisement, not the practical reasons? Why did a woman like you travel 6 days into the middle of nowhere to marry a stranger? Rose was quiet for a while, watching the horses in the far corral swishing their tails at flies. Because I was tired, she said at last. Tired of running. Tired of being the person who leaves before she gets left behind. Tired of cooking for strangers and disappearing before sunrise. She looked at Caleb. And because the advertisement said the word build a family, I haven't built anything in a very long time. I wanted to try, even though it's scary, especially because it's scary. That afternoon, when the wagon returned loaded with supplies, Gideon jumped down and walked straight to the kitchen where Rose was preparing dinner. He stood in the doorway, 6 feet 5 inches of muscle and scar tissue, and for the first time since she had arrived, there was no hostility in his eyes. Instead, there was something Rose had not expected. Shame. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice rough as rock on rock. You don't have to. I do. Gideon stepped inside his enormous hands, clenching and unclenching as if he were trying to control every muscle in his body. I called you a thing, called you catalog goods, said you didn't belong here. He stopped. His jaw worked. I was wrong about all of it. Why did you hate me? Rose asked directly. Truly, not because of the soup. Not because the ranch is struggling. The real reason. Gideon was silent for so long that Rose thought he would walk away. Then he spoke barely above a whisper. Because you reminded me of her. Sarah, Margaret. The name left his mouth like broken glass. My fiancée ran off with a silver tray 3 weeks before the wedding. Same year Sarah died. He looked down at his scarred hands. Lost my sister-in-law to sickness. Lost my bride to betrayal. Same year. And I decided that women would either die on you or betray you, and both roads led to suffering. So I stopped letting anyone close. And then I showed up. And then you showed up, cooking like Sarah used to cook, bringing this place back to life, making the men laugh, making Silas walk into this kitchen for the first time in 3 years. Gideon met her eyes, and Rose saw it clearly beneath the armor, and the scars, a broken heart, terrified of being broken again. You scare me, because you show me what I've been missing, and I hate that feeling. Rose set down her wooden spoon. I understand, Gideon, more than you think. She did not tell him about Emma, not yet, but she understood the way grief becomes anger, the way anger becomes a wall, the way a wall becomes a prison you build around yourself. Apology accepted. Now, sit down, eat, and stop trying to scare me off. Something cracked across Gideon's face. If Rose was not mistaken, it was almost a smile. Almost. What's for dinner? Fried chicken. This time I have the supplies for it. Good, because that soup was truly terrible. It kept you alive, didn't it? Doesn't mean it was good. And just like that, like snow melting after a long winter, Gideon Hawthorne began to thaw. Not completely, not quickly, but enough for Rose to catch a glimpse of the man beneath the scars. That evening at dinner, Silas stood and addressed the table. Rose has been here 1 week. The weekend's tonight. He looked at her. If you want to leave, the mail coach runs Tuesday. Rose looked around the table at the faces that had become familiar over 7 days. Walt in his eternal pipe, Jed in his meaningful silence, Caleb and his hopeful dimple, Emmett and his leather worker's rough hands, Gideon still scowling but sitting at the table eating the food she had made, and that alone was a revolution. And Silas, those winter whiskey eyes, the grief, the strength, and deep beneath the granite something fragile and trembling that Rose recognized as hope. I'm staying, Rose said, not for another week, not because of a bride advertisement, because I want to be here, because this place needs me. She paused and her voice dropped. And maybe I need this place too. Caleb whooped. Emmett slapped the table. Walt nodded as though he had known all along. Jed for the second time smiled. Gideon said nothing, but he nodded once, firm and final, and that single nod was worth more than any words he could have spoken. Silas met Rose's eyes across the length of the dinner table. Welcome to Shadow Creek, Rose. The words hung in the air between them, simple and enormous, carrying a weight that neither of them fully understood yet. Welcome. Such a small word for such a large thing. She had not been welcomed anywhere in 3 years. She had been tolerated, employed, endured, but not welcomed. Not like this, with a full table and oil lamp light and the quiet approval of men who had every reason to distrust her and had chosen not to. Rose felt something crack open inside her chest, something she had kept locked down and boarded up since the night her sister died in her arms. It hurt. It hurt the way frozen fingers hurt when they start to warm the pain of coming back to life after you have been numb so long, you forgot what feeling was. She did not let it show. She smiled and nodded and said thank you and began clearing the plates. And neither of them knew that this moment, this welcome, this decision to stay, was the beginning of something none of them were ready for. Something that would test every one of them in ways that food could not heal. Something that was already stirring in the darkness beyond the ranch house walls, waiting for the right moment to strike. But for now, in this moment, with the smell of fried chicken still hanging in the air and the sound of satisfied men drifting through the walls, Rose Sinclair allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place that would not throw her away. Even if the real test was still coming. Even if the ranch was 3 months from bankruptcy and she did not yet know it. Even if a woman named Victoria Ashford was watching from the neighboring spread 3,000 acres of ambition and cold calculation, making plans that would threaten everything Shadow Creek had left. Even if the cruelest winter in 20 years was gathering itself in the mountains above clouds, stacking against the peaks, like an army massing at the border, preparing to descend. Rose did not know any of that yet. All she knew was that for the first time in 3 years, she did not want to run. And that terrified her more than anything Gideon Hawthorne could ever say. The first 2 weeks passed in a rhythm Rose had never known before. Not the rhythm of drifting, of packing up before dawn and moving on to the next kitchen and the next set of strangers, but the rhythm of belonging. She woke every morning at 4 before the sun had any business rising and built the fire in the stove that Sarah Hawthorne had designed and Silas Hawthorne had built with his own hands. She measured coffee. She listened to the ranch wake up around her boots on the bunkhouse floor. Horses stirring in the barn, the wind coming down off the mountains carrying the smell of pine and coming snow. She cooked breakfast, biscuits, bacon eggs, gravy coffee so strong it could strip paint. And she watched the men come in. Walt was always first slow as sorghum, but punctual as a church bell, settling into his chair and his pipe already lit and his eyes already sharp. Then Jed, nodding once, saying nothing, eating everything. Then the younger hands, Caleb leading the way with his dimple and his easy grin, Emmett, and the others filing in behind. Gideon came last, always last, sitting at the far end of the table, eating without comment, but his bowl was always empty when he brought it back. Silas came and went. He never lingered at meals. He ate quickly, nodded once at Rose, not a thank you exactly, more like an acknowledgement that she existed, and that her existence was not unwelcome, and then he vanished into the work that consumed his days. But Rose noticed something small. Every morning he paused in the kitchen doorway for 1 extra second, then 2, then 3, breathing in, as if the smell of coffee and fresh bread was something he needed to absorb before he could face what waited outside. Rose did not just cook. She cleaned the kitchen again, deeper this time, scrubbing into corners that had not seen a rag in years. She took a proper inventory of the pantry and discovered that Shadow Creek was 3 weeks away from running out of flour entirely, had no sugar left at all, and was down to the last jar of preserved vegetables from whoever had put them up 2 summers ago. She made lists. She calculated. She planned. She also began to make the ranch house feel like something other than a mausoleum. She sewed curtains for the kitchen window from washed flour sacks. She put wildflowers in a jar on the dining table. She reorganized the spice shelf and scrubbed the kitchen floor until it reflected light. Each change was small, a seed that nobody noticed individually. But after 2 weeks, the kitchen had come back to life, and the men who ate there every day were different people than they had been when Rose arrived. Caleb was the first to say it out loud. "Looks like when Mama was alive," he whispered one morning, staring at the new curtains. Rose did not know how to answer that, so she put an extra biscuit on his plate and kept working. But beneath the warmth, beneath the curtains and the flowers and the clean floors, Rose could feel something wrong. The numbers did not add up. Food consumption against budget, operating costs against income. She was the daughter of an accountant, a drunk and a failure, but an accountant all the same, and numbers were her second language after cooking. And the numbers were screaming that Shadow Creek Ranch was dying. She found Silas in the barn shoeing a horse. "We need to talk about money," she said without preamble. Silas did not look up. "Town's 20 miles south. Supply runs every 2 weeks. We went last week." "Then you bought from the wrong supplier, or you didn't buy enough, or someone is stealing." That got his attention. "Nobody steals from this ranch." "Then explain why you're almost out of basics with 15 people to feed." Silas set the horse's hoof down and straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He was so tall that even standing 6 feet away, Rose had to look up to meet his eyes. "We make do with what we have." "You can't make do with empty sacks, Silas. I can't cook with air." "I'll handle it." Because dinner is in 6 hours and I'm already rationing portions." "I said I'll handle it." Rose stepped closer, close enough to smell horse and metal and the frustration coming off him in waves. "You brought me here to cook. I can't cook nothing. Either give me a budget for supplies or admit this ranch is broke." The silence between them stretched like barbed wire. "We're not broke," Silas finally said. "We're lean. There's a difference." "How lean?" "Lean enough that I can't spare hands for a supply run until Saturday. That's 4 days from now." Rose wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that his pride was going to starve his men. Instead, she turned around, walked back to the kitchen, and started planning how to feed 15 hungry people on almost nothing for 4 more days. She had done it before, in logging camps with less, in mining towns with worse. This was not the hardest thing she had ever done, but it might have been the most important. The moment that changed everything came in the 3rd week when Silas finally handed her the ledger. "Ranch finances," he said, setting the heavy book on the kitchen table after the men had gone to work. "You deserve to know where we stand." Rose opened it and spent 2 days reading every page. What she found made her sick to her stomach. "You're paying double the market rate for cattle feed," she told Silas on the third morning the ledger spread open between them. "This supplier is gouging you. He's the only supplier within 50 miles. "No, he isn't. There's one in Abilene that delivers for half the price. I found their advertisement in an old newspaper in the pantry." Rose pointed to another entry. "And here you're paying taxes on a parcel of land you don't own anymore. This section was sold 4 years ago according to the deed records, but you're still being billed for it." Silas stared. "How did I miss this?" "Because you were drowning. It's hard to see solutions when you can barely breathe." Rose turned to another page. "And here the bank has been charging you 2% above the standard interest rate. For 3 years, that's hundreds of dollars in excess interest." Then she reached the page she had been dreading. "Silas, how much does the ranch owe the bank?" The silence lasted a long time. Then he said it. $15,000. My father took out the loan before he died. I've been paying interest, but the bank wants the principal, all of it, by March. If we can't pay, they take the land." Rose felt the floor tilt beneath her. $15,000. "I have about 3,000 saved," Silas continued. "Cattle won't bring in enough. Feed costs are eating us alive. And now with the storm damage from last winter," he closed the ledger. "I'm telling you because if you're staying, you should know what you're staying for. This might be a sinking ship." "Let me help," Rose said. "Not just with cooking, with the finances. I'm good with numbers. My father kept books for a logging camp in Oregon before he—" She paused. "Before he died. He taught me. Numbers don't lie, Silas. People do. But numbers tell the truth." Silas looked at her small hand reaching across the table flour dusted and scarred from a lifetime of kitchen burns. He looked at her face, those cornflower blue eyes steady and certain, in a way that he had not seen in anyone, including himself, for a very long time, and he handed her the ledger. Rose spent 2 more days going through the books and found another $1,200 in recoverable funds from tax fraud and overpayments. She identified ways to cut monthly costs by 30% by switching suppliers and eliminating redundancies. She built a projection model that showed if every change was implemented, the ranch could survive 6 months instead of 3. "This doesn't solve everything," she told Silas, exhaustion making her voice rough. "But it buys time." Silas reached across the table and took her hand. Rose's breath caught. His hand was calloused and enormous, swallowing hers completely warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing things I couldn't see, for caring about a place that isn't yours." Rose pulled her hand back, heart hammering. "It is mine," she said quietly. "I decided that the night I stayed." But there was something else, something that nagged at her as she dug deeper into the tax records. The fraudulent assessments were not random errors. Someone had deliberately inflated Shadow Creek's tax burden year after year, bleeding the ranch of money it could not afford to lose. This was not incompetence. This was sabotage. And the trail, faint but unmistakable, led to a name Rose did not yet know, but would soon learn to fear. Victoria Ashford, owner of the neighboring ranch. 3,000 acres of ambition wrapped in widow's black. The storm came without proper warning. One morning the sky was clear. By noon the horizon had gone the color of a bruised purple-black clouds rolling in from the west like an invading army. Walt stood on the porch pipe clenched between his teeth and said 2 words that made Rose's blood go cold. "Storm coming." Silas and Gideon had left for town at dawn with the supply wagon. Rose's 3-page list was folded in Silas's coat pocket. They were due back by 3 in the afternoon. By 2 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. By 2:30, the first snowflakes began to fall. Fat, wet, heavy flakes, the kind that meant business. 3 o'clock came and went, no wagon. 3:30, Jed bowed his head and whispered a prayer. 4 o'clock, the snow was falling so thick that Rose could not see the barn from the house. "They should have been back by now," Emmett said, giving voice to what everyone was thinking. "Road might be slow," Walt offered, but his voice carried no conviction. 4:30, Caleb stood up. "I'm riding out." "You'll freeze to death," Rose heard herself say. "Better than sit and tear while my brothers die out there." "Nobody's dying," Rose's voice was steel. "Not if I can help it." She moved to the stove and started working, heating broth, wrapping bread in cloth, filling thermoses with coffee so hot it could burn through leather. Her hands knew what to do even when her mind was screaming. At 5 o'clock, with darkness falling and the storm howling like something alive and hungry, they heard it. Wagon wheels, horses screaming, men shouting. Everyone rushed to the door. The wagon careened into the yard at a sickening angle, one wheel shattered supplies spilling into the snow like blood from a wound. Silas was on the driver's bench, ice crusted in his beard, his hands frozen to the reins. Gideon hung off the side of the wagon, blooded on his face, one arm hanging at an angle that made Rose's stomach lurch. Caleb and Jed sprinted into the storm. Rose grabbed the thermos and followed. The cold hit her like a fist. It stole her breath, tried to steal her courage, but she pushed through it, reached the wagon, shoved the thermos into Silas's hands. "Drink," she commanded. "Gideon," Silas managed through chattering teeth. "I see him. Drink first, then help." His hands were so frozen he could not open the thermos. Rose opened it for him and held it to his lips. He drank, coughed, drank again. "Wheel broke 5 miles out," he said, his words slurred with cold. Gideon jumped down to fix it. Horse spooked, kicked him, arms broken, maybe ribs too. They got Gideon inside, got both men by the fire. Rose's hands moved on instinct. Hot water, clean cloths. Jed held Gideon still while Rose set the broken arm using torn strips of bedsheet because there were no proper splints and no doctor within 40 miles. Gideon screamed once, then passed out. "Good," Rose muttered. "Easier this way." She wrapped his ribs, checked the gash on his forehead, made sure his breathing was steady. Then she turned to Silas, who was sitting by the fire trying not to shake apart. "Take off the coat." "I'm fine." "You're hypothermic. Take off the coat or I'll cut it off you." He was too cold to argue. She stripped him down to his undershirt, wrapped him in every blanket she could find, and forced more hot coffee down his throat. His lips were blue. His hands would not stop trembling. "The supplies," he mumbled. "To hell with the supplies. You almost died." "Got most of it." The Cowboys had dragged the sacks inside. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee beans, rice-dried meat, ard. Everything on her list, and then some. Rose felt tear burn her eyes hot against the cold on her face. This man had nearly killed himself bringing her groceries. "You're an idiot," she whispered. "Yeah," Silas agreed, teeth still chattering. "But you got your supplies." That was when Rose knew. This was not just a wow. This was not just a place to stay. This was something else entirely, something that terrified her more than any storm. The blizzard did not stop for 3 days. Rose slept in the chair by the fire watching Gideon breathe and Silas shiver under blankets that could not seem to warm him fast enough. She had sent the other men to the bunkhouse with orders to stay put and stay warm. But she could not leave these two, would not leave them. The second morning, Gideon's fever spiked. Rose pressed cool claws to his forehead through the night, spooned broth between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow. Silas woke periodically, confused and disoriented, asking about cattle and fences and things that could not possibly matter until he could stand without falling. "Rest," Rose would whisper, pressing him back down. "Can't rest. Work to do." "The work can wait. You can't." On the third day, Gideon opened his eyes clear and lucid and found Rose sitting beside him, dark circles under her eyes, her hair escaping from its pins, looking like she had not slept in a week. Because she had not. "You're still here," he said, his voice like gravel. "Where else would I be?" "Anywhere. Anywhere that isn't this." He gestured weakly at the bandages, the blood, the wreckage of a man who had spent 3 years pretending he did not need anyone. "You set my arm. You wrapped my ribs. You stayed up 3 nights watching me breathe." He swallowed hard. "Margaret wouldn't have done that. Margaret would have been on the first stage out of here the night I opened my mouth at that dinner table." "I'm not Margaret." "No, you're not." Gideon was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, younger. The voice of the man he had been before the scar and the betrayal and the years of turning anger into armor. "I've been punishing every woman I meet for what one woman did to me. Punishing you most of all because you had the nerve to show up and be kind, and kindness is the thing I can't fight." He looked at the ceiling. "You know what scares me more than losing this ranch? The fact that I'm lying here with a broken arm and cracked ribs, and the only thing I can think about is whether you'll still be in that kitchen when I'm well enough to walk again. Rose set the cloth down and looked at him, this enormous, scarred, impossible man who had called her a catalog girl and was now terrified she might leave. Gideon, I will be in that kitchen tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, until you are so sick of my cooking that you beg me to stop. Something broke across his face that was not a smile but was close enough to count. That soup was still terrible, though. Go to sleep, Gideon. When Silas finally woke up fully, no fever, no confusion, just clear-eyed and present, he found Rose asleep in the chair beside him, her head tilted at an angle that would hurt when she woke up. He stood slowly testing his legs and draped his own blanket over her shoulders. She did not stir. He stood there for a long time watching her sleep, and something inside his chest that had been sealed shut for 3 years cracked open like river ice in spring. You're staring. Rose's eyes were still closed. Didn't mean to wake you. You didn't. Your thinking woke me. It's loud. Didn't know thinking had a volume. She opened her eyes and looked at him. You're standing. Appears so. How do you feel? Like I got kicked by every horse in the barn and left outside in a blizzard. He paused. But alive. Thanks to you. Thanks to coffee and blankets. Thanks to you refusing to let me die. Silas moved closer. Why did you do it? You could have stayed inside. Could have let the men handle it. Because men don't always handle things right. Rose stood wincing as her neck protested 3 days of sleeping upright. And because I already told you each pay my debts. You paid that debt 5 meals ago. Then maybe I'm staying for a different reason. What reason? Rose met his eyes, winter whiskey and cornflower blue. I haven't figured that out yet. But she was figuring it out, faster than she wanted to. And one evening a week after the blizzard, sitting beside Silas on the porch while the stars came out over the mountains and the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet, Rose told him the truth she had been carrying for 5 years. I had a sister, she said, and the words came out before she could stop them. Emma. She was 3 years old. She died of fever, same as your wife, 3 days. I held her the whole time. I held her and I prayed and I begged and none of it mattered. Rose's voice cracked like thin ice. After that, I couldn't stay anywhere. Couldn't build anything. Because everything I loved, I lost. Everyone I held on to, I had to bury, so I kept moving. Kitchen to kitchen, town to town, paying debts nobody asked me to pay because it was easier than standing still long enough to remember what standing still cost me. Silas did not speak, did not offer empty comfort or hollow reassurance. He simply put his arm around her shoulders and let her lean against him, this enormous man who smelled of leather and wood smoke and grief, and let her cry until she had nothing left. I'm sorry, she whispered when the tears stopped. Don't be sorry for grieving. I'm sorry for pretending. For acting like I came here because of an advertisement when really I came because I had nowhere left to run. You're here now, that's what matters. And then so gently that Rose barely felt it. Silas pressed his lips to her forehead. Not a kiss born of passion or desire, but something quieter and more profound. A benediction, a promise made without words. You are safe here. You are allowed to stay. Rose went to bed that night with her heart beating in a way it had not beaten in years, and for the first time since Emma died, she did not dream of running. 2 weeks after the blizzard, the first real threat arrived. Not from the weather, not from the bank, from a woman. Gerald Pritchard came first, the bank's man riding in on a buggy too clean for ranch roads, and wearing a suit too fine for honest work. He carried a briefcase and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Mr. Hawthorne, I'm afraid the bank's position hasn't changed. We need full payment by March 15th or we'll be forced to foreclose. That's 4 months away, Silas said. I told your boss I'm working on it. Working on it isn't a payment plan. Pritchard glanced at Rose standing on the porch in her flour-dusted apron. I see you've taken on additional staff. Interesting choice for a ranch claiming financial hardship. She's not additional staff. Silas began, but Rose cut him off, stepping down from the porch with a voice like polished iron. I'm an investment. Mr. Hawthorne brought me in to reorganize operations and reduce costs. We've already identified $1,200 in recoverable funds and cut monthly expenses by 30%. She crossed her arms. So unless your bank wants to foreclose on a ranch that's about to turn profitable, I'd suggest giving us the time we're asking for. Pritchard's eyebrows rose. And who exactly are you, Shoiman? Someone who knows that numbers don't lie and banks do. Rose held his gaze without blinking. Your institution has been overcharging Mr. Hawthorne on interest for 3 years. We have documentation. We also have evidence of fraudulent tax assessments on this property. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to take our payment plan back to your superior, and you are going to recommend that he accept it. Because if you don't, we'll be filing complaints with the State Banking Commission regarding predatory lending practices. The color left Pritchard's face like water draining from a sink. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation. Rose stepped closer, 5'3", of absolute certainty, staring up at a man who had expected to bully a rancher and found a wall instead. We're not asking for charity. We're asking for fair treatment. Can you provide that, or should I start writing letters to Austin? Pritchard snapped his briefcase shut. I'll relay your proposal to my superiors. He was gone, and within minutes, dust from his buggy hanging in the still air like a question mark. Silas stared at Rose. What just happened? I called his bluff. Banks hate scrutiny, hate it more than they hate losing money. She turned to go back inside. He'll be back with better terms within the week. 3 days later, a telegram arrived. New terms, lower interest, deadline extended to June, formal apology for the tax assessment errors. But Rose did not celebrate, because when she had dug deeper into those fraudulent tax records, she had found what she was looking for. A pattern, a signature. Not the banks doing it all, but the work of someone else. Someone who had been quietly bleeding Shadow Creek Ranch for years, tightening the financial noose inch by inch, waiting for the moment when the Hawthorns would be desperate enough to sell for pennies on the dollar. Victoria Ashford, owner of Ashford Acres, 3,000 acres, twice the size of Shadow Creek. And Rose was certain now that Victoria was not interested in the land for ranching. She was interested in the railroad, the new line being surveyed through the San Juan Range, a line that would run directly through Shadow Creek's eastern pasture, turning worthless grazing land into the most valuable real estate in the territory. Rose kept this discovery to herself for now. She needed proof. She needed time. And she needed Silas to trust her completely before she told him that his neighbor had been trying to destroy him for years. The evening before the cattle drive, Silas found Rose in the kitchen. The plan was set. He and Gideon and Jed, along with 2 hands borrowed from a neighboring spread, one of them a young cousin of Caleb's named Thatcher, who was barely 19 and had never been on a real drive before, would push 40 head of prime cattle to the railhead buyers gathering in Wichita Falls. 6 to 8 weeks on the trail, maybe $3,000 if the prices held. That's 2 months, Rose said, and she could not keep the tremor from her voice. I know how long 2 months is. You're leaving the ranch, leaving your brothers, leaving... She stopped. Leaving you. Silas met her eyes. But this is our best shot at real money before spring. Rose wanted to argue, wanted to tell him it was too dangerous, too long, too much risk for a man whose ribs had not fully healed from being trampled by his own horse in a blizzard. But she knew ranching. Sometimes you had to bet everything to save anything. While you're gone, she said, I'm reorganizing the winter operations. The cattle we're keeping need better feed management. I found a supplier who'll trade beef for hay at fair rates. And Walt says there's a vegetable farmer near Abilene who might partner with us for spring planting. You're building a farm on a cattle ranch. I'm diversifying income. Cattle prices go up and down. Food prices stay steady. If we can grow vegetables for the nearby towns, we create revenue that doesn't depend on the cattle market. Silas shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in something closer to wonder. Where did you learn economics? From watching men lose everything betting on one crop, one mine, one cattle season. My father lost 3 fortunes gambling on sure things. I learned to never put everything you have in one place. That night, Silas gave her something that stopped her heart. A recipe card handwritten in faded ink. Peach cobbler. Sarah Hawthorne's original recipe. The one the whole ranch remembered. The one that had made Sunday mornings smell like heaven. Found this in my wife's things, he said. Thought you might want it. Rose's throat closed. I can't take this. Yes, you can. Sarah would have wanted someone to use it. Someone who cares about feeding people the way she did. He pressed the card into her hand. Keep the ranch running while I'm gone. Keep the men fed and focused. And Rose, yes, don't run. Promise me you won't run. Rose looked at the recipe card, at this man who had somehow become essential to the rhythm of her breathing, at the ranch that had stopped feeling like a bum and started feeling like the thing she had spent 3 years running from. Home. I promise, she whispered. The next morning, the drovers moved out at first light. Silas on his horse, tall and straight, despite ribs that were not fully mended. Gideon beside him, Scar catching the early sun, looking back once at the ranch house, and then not again. Jed riding quiet and steady at the rear. 40 head of cattle raising dust behind them, moving north toward Kansas, and money and whatever waited on the trail. Rose stood in the yard and watched until they disappeared over the ridge. In her hand, she held a dead woman's recipe. In her chest, she held something far more fragile, something she had not allowed herself to carry in 3 years. Hope. And the terrible knowledge that hope, once you let it in, gives the world permission to hurt you all over again. Well, Walt said behind her, guess it's just us now. Guess so. You really staying? Rose folded the recipe card carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket next to her heart. I promised, didn't I? Promises are easy. Keeping them's the hard part. Then I guess we'll find out what I'm made of. She turned from the empty road and walked back toward the kitchen, toward the stove that needed lighting, and the bread that needed baking, and the 12 men who still needed feeding. Behind her, the mountains rose white and silent against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Somewhere beyond those peaks, Silas Hawthorne was riding toward money that might save them. Somewhere closer, Victoria Ashford was sitting in her own ranch house planning her next move. And somewhere deep inside Rose Sinclair, the girl who had spent 3 years running from everything that mattered, was finally learning what it felt like to stand still. The first week without Silas was the strangest Rose had ever lived through. The ranch felt emptier than its size could explain, as though someone had removed a load-bearing wall and the whole structure was holding its breath, waiting to see if it would stand or fall. She threw herself into work the way a drowning person throws herself toward shore. Cooking, planning, organizing, pushing the remaining men to maintain standards even with half the hands gone and the best riders somewhere on the trail north of Wichita Falls. She started a garden behind the cookhouse, turning frozen ground with techniques she had learned in Oregon, building coal frames from scrap lumber and old window glass to protect seedlings from the frost. She convinced Walt to help her construct a proper smokehouse for preserving meat to sell. She rode to Abilene herself a full day each way and negotiated a partnership with a vegetable farmer named Cuthbert, who agreed to trade seed stock and equipment for beef at fair rates. She drew up contracts with 3 nearby towns for regular food deliveries, butter and smoked meat, and whatever the garden would eventually produce. Caleb watched her with something between admiration and disbelief. You're like a general, he said one evening, sitting on the porch while Rose reviewed her notes by lamplight. Drawing up campaigns, planning strategy. I'm like someone who finally stopped running, she corrected, not looking up. On the 10th day, a woman arrived. She came in a hired buggy, dressed entirely in black, with a face that could have been carved from white marble and eyes that missed nothing. Rose was in the garden elbow, deep in cold soil, when Walt called her over. His voice had a careful quality to it, the kind of care a man uses when he is trying not to spook a horse. This is Mrs. Victoria Ashford, Walt said. She owns the ranch next door. She's here to see you. Victoria studied Rose the way a hawk studies a field mouse, with patience and absolute certainty about how the encounter would end. So you're the cook everyone is talking about. I'm Rose Sinclair. Can I help you? Perhaps I can help you. Victoria produced a document from a leather portfolio. I'm prepared to pay $8,000 cash for Shadow Creek Ranch. Today. Rose felt her heart stutter. That's not enough to cover his debts. It's enough to walk away clean. The bank would accept a partial payment in exchange for releasing the lien. Mr. Hawthorne could start fresh somewhere else, somewhere without the weight of a dying ranch around his neck. This is his home. This is a failing business that is dragging him under. Victoria's voice softened just enough to sound sincere, not enough for Rose to believe it. I'm not trying to cheat him, Miss Sinclair. I'm offering a way out before he loses everything. And what about the men? What happens to them? I'd keep most of them. Good hands are hard to find. Rose looked at the document at the number that represented everything Silas had fought for him, everything 3 generations of Hawthorns had built with nothing but cattle and stubbornness, and the kind of hope that refuses to deed even when it should. $8,000. A fortune to some. Not enough, never enough. I can't accept on his behalf, Rose said slowly, but I'll make sure he receives your offer when he returns. Don't wait too long. The offer expires in 30 days. Victoria climbed back into her buggy, then paused and looked down at Rose, small and dirt-stained in her work dress, and something flickered across her face that might have been pity or might have been contempt. And Miss Sinclair, whatever you think you're building here, it won't last. This ranch is dead. You're just too stubborn to see it. The buggy rolled away and Rose stood holding a piece of paper that could solve everything or destroy it all. That evening, she called a meeting. Every remaining hand gathered in the dining room. Caleb, Walt, Emmett, and 6 others. Rose laid out the situation with the same directness she used for everything, no softening, no false comfort, just the truth served plain. We could tell Silas to sell, she said. Walk away, start over. Or, Caleb asked, and his eyes were burning, or we prove Victoria Ashford wrong. We make this ranch profitable before Silas gets back. We show him that staying is worth fighting for. How? Walt leaned back in his chair, pipe in hand, expression unreadable. In 6 weeks. By working harder than we've ever worked. By implementing every efficiency we've discussed. By getting the vegetable partnership running and bringing in cash before spring. By starting a small dairy operation with those 4 cows nobody thinks are worth keeping. Rose met each man's eyes around the table. By deciding that Shadow Creek Ranch is worth saving. I'm in, Caleb said immediately. Me too, Emmett added. One by one, every man at the table agreed. Walt was last. He took a long pull on his pipe, let the smoke curl toward the ceiling, and said, you know this might not work. I know. You know Silas might come back and decide to sell anyway. I know that too. Then why fight? Rose thought about the recipe card in her pocket, about Silas asking her not to run, about the way this place had become home while she was not looking. Because some things are worth fighting for, Walt, even when you're scared, even when the odds are terrible, even when quitting would be easier. The next 6 weeks were the hardest of Rose's life, and she had lived through some hard ones. They worked from before dawn until after dark and sometimes beyond. They planted vegetables in frozen ground using the cold frames Rose had built. They finished the smokehouse and started curing meat for sale. They negotiated delivery contracts. They launched the dairy operation. Rose cooked 3 meals a day for the remaining crew and somehow still found time to balance the books, manage the supply chains, and write letters to potential buyers in 4 different towns. Victoria Ashford sent 2 more offers, each one higher than the last. Rose burned them without reading past the first line. You've lost your mind, Walt told her after the 3rd one went into the stove. Probably. What if we fail? Then we fail trying. That's more than this ranch was doing before. Money started trickling in. Small amounts but steady. The dairy contracts. Smoked meat sold to the general stores in town. Emmett taught Rose leatherworking, and she started repairing and selling tack. Caleb began breaking horses for neighboring ranches, another income stream that nobody had thought to tap. 4 weeks in disasters struck 3 times in a single week. 2 of the dairy cows got in a spoiled feed and died. An early frost threatened the vegetable crop, and the biggest delivery contract fell apart when the buyer found a cheaper supplier 50 miles south. Rose stood in the kitchen at midnight, adding up numbers that refused to add up, and felt the old familiar pull, the whisper that had followed her from kitchen to kitchen for 3 years. Just go, pack the trunk, leave before sunrise. Let someone else clean up the mess. She pulled out Sarah Hawthorne's recipe card and read the faded handwriting. 3 cups peaches, 1 cup sugar, butter, cinnamon, love. Sarah had written that word. Love as an ingredient, as essential as flour or salt or heat. Rose laughed, then she cried. Then she wiped her face with her apron and went back to work. By week 5, they had earned $1,700, not enough to save the ranch alone. But combined with whatever Silas brought back from the cattle drive, it might just barely be enough to renegotiate the bank loan and buy another year. On the morning of the 6th week, Rose stood in the kitchen before dawn rolling out biscuit dough and watching the road through the window. Any day now, Silas would return. Any day now, she would have to tell him about Victoria's offers, about the money they had made, about the choices that waited. Any day now, she would have to face what had been growing between them, this thing she felt every time she read his short telegrams from the trail. Cattle healthy, making progress, miss your coffee. She had read the word miss 47 times. She knew because she counted. The kitchen door opened. Rose turned flour on her hands, hope caught in her throat like a bone. But it was not Silas. Walt stood there, his face the color of old ash, holding a telegram, the way a man holds a live coal. "What is it?" Rose asked, but she already knew, already felt it in the sudden cold that filled the room like floodwater. "Accident," Walt said, and his voice cracked down the middle. "Stampede outside Dodge City. 3 men hurt, 2 dead." His hand trembled. "Telegram doesn't say who." The biscuit dough fell from Rose's hands and hit the floor. She stared at the white lump on the boards and could not make her brain connect to her body. 2 dead, 2 dead, and the telegram did not say who, and Silas was out there somewhere. Silas with his ribs that had not fully healed, Silas, who had ridden north carrying her promise like a talisman against disaster. Caleb burst through the door. "Is it true about the drive?" "We don't know anything yet," Walt said. Rose found her breath. It took everything she had, every ounce of the stubbornness that had carried her through 3 years of running and 6 weeks of fighting, but she found it. "Saddle a horse." "What?" "Saddle a horse. I'm riding to Dodge City." "That's 3 days hard riding. You'll kill yourself." "Then I'll die trying." Rose untied her apron and hung it on the hook by the stove. The hook Sarah had probably used. The hook that had held 100 aprons before this one. "I'm not sitting here wondering if he's alive or dead. I'm not running this time. I'm going to him." She grabbed her coat and headed for the door. Behind her, Walt called out, "What do we tell the men?" Rose stopped, turned. "Tell them the truth. Tell them we don't know yet. Tell them we keep working until we hear different." Her voice hardened into something that could have cut glass. "And tell them that Shadow Creek Ranch does not quit. Not for banks, not for neighbors, not for death itself." She walked into the cold morning air toward the barn, toward a horse that would carry her across 3 days of empty country to whatever waited in Dodge City. Toward the truth she had been running from her entire life. That love meant risking everything, and she was finally, terrifyingly, completely ready to risk it all. Rose rode for 3 days. She stopped only when the horse could go no further, sleeping on the ground wrapped in a single blanket, eating nothing, drinking from streams, pushing forward, with a single thought burning in her mind like a signal fire. Alive. He has to be alive. When she reached Dodge City, her hands were blistered raw from the rains, her eyes were burning from dust and wind, and the tears she had not allowed herself to shed while the horse was moving. The stockyards sprawled before her, enormous and chaotic pens full of cattle drovers, everywhere the smell of animals and commerce thick in the air. She dismounted on legs that barely held her and grabbed the first cowboy she saw. "The stampede, where are the survivors?" He pointed to a building at the edge of the yards. "Doc's got them in there, but lady, you don't want to." Rose was already running. The building was half hospital, half chaos. Injured men on cots, a doctor barking orders. The smell of blood and carbolic acid so strong it made her eyes water. She scanned the room, heart pounding so hard she could hear it like hoofbeats in her skull. Gideon sat in a corner, his arm rebandaged, his face gray with pain, but his eyes open and alert. Jed lay on a cot nearby, unconscious but breathing. Rose registered them both in a single glance, and then kept searching because the one face she needed to see was not there. "Gideon, where is he?" Gideon looked up, and the expression on his face told her everything she needed to know before he opened his mouth. "Not the West, but close. He's alive." The relief nearly buckled her knees. "But he's bad, Rose. Real bad." She found him in a back room alone except for a nurse changing bandages on his chest. His shirt was gone. His torso was wrapped in white cloth already seeping red. His face was so pale that he looked like a man made of paper, fragile and thin, in one strong wind from tearing apart. But his chest rose and fell, shallow and labored but real. Family, the nurse asked. Close enough. Stampede. Cattle spooked at lightning. He was trying to turn the herd. Horse went down under him. Took a hoof to the ribs, maybe more than one. Got trampled before the others could pull him clear. Lost a lot of blood. Will he live? The nurse hesitated. Maybe, if infection doesn't set in, if his lungs stay clear, if he's strong enough to fight. He's strong enough. Rose took Silas's hand. It was cold. Cold as the night she had held the thermos to his blue lips in the blizzard. He's the strongest man I know. The nurse left them alone. Rose sat beside the bed and held his hand and talked. She talked about the ranch, about the $1,700 they had made, about Victoria Ashford's offers and how she had burned every one, about the garden and the dairy and the smokehouse and the contracts she had negotiated, about Walt's loyalty and Caleb's courage and Emmett's quiet dependability. She told him about Emma again, not the facts he already knew, but the parts she had held back even on that night on the porch. How she had carried her sister's small body to the doctor herself because there was nobody else to do it. How the weight of that child, so light and so impossibly heavy, had never left her arms. How every kitchen she had worked in since then had been an attempt to feed the emptiness that Emma's death had carved inside her. How she had been running from that emptiness ever since until a stubborn rancher and his broken brothers in a dead woman's kitchen had given her a reason to stop. But I'm done running, she whispered, pressing his cold hand against her cheek. Even if you don't make it, even if I lose you too, I'm staying at Shadow Creek. I'm fighting for that ranch because it's worth fighting for, because those men are worth it, because you taught me that some things matter more than protecting yourself from pain. His hand twitched. Rose's breath stopped. Silas? His eyes opened slowly, unfocused, wandering, then finding her face and holding on like a man finding solid ground after days at sea. Rose, I'm here. You rode to Dodge City. 3 days, nearly killed the horse and myself. That's foolish. I learned from the best. He tried to smile and winced instead, pain flashing across his face like lightning. The boy, Thatcher, Caleb's cousin, is he alive? Thanks to you, you went back for him. That's why you were in the path when the herd came through. Gideon appeared in the doorway. Drive boss says the cattle sold. Good prices. About $3,000 after expenses. I don't care about the money, Rose said without turning around. You should. It's what he nearly died for. Gideon sat heavily in the chair on the other side of the bed. He saved that kid Rose, youngest drover on the crew. Got thrown when the stampede started, and Silas turned back for him. Rode straight into the path of 40 head of panicking cattle to pull a boy off the ground. Gideon's scarred face twisted with something that was either grief or pride or both. Always the hero, always thinking about everyone else, never himself. Rose squeezed Silas's hand. Wake up properly, you stubborn fool. Wake up and tell me yourself. Silas's eyes focused on her face. You've been crying. Dust. Your eyes are red. It's dusty in Dodge City. Rose. She broke. Yes, I've been crying. I thought you were dead. I thought I'd lost you before I could tell you. She stopped. Tell me what... Rose looked at this man, this impossible, stubborn, infuriating man who had pulled her into his life through an advertisement he did not even write, who had given her 3 hours to prove herself and then stood back in amazement when she did, who had trusted her with his finances and his ranch and his men and the recipe card of his dead wife, who had ridden north with broken ribs to earn the money that might save his home and then thrown himself into the path of a stampede to save a boy he barely knew. Tell you that I love you, she said, simply, like stating a fact, like saying the sky is blue or water runs downhill, that I'm tired of pretending I don't, that I want to stay at Shadow Creek, not because I owe anyone anything, but because I can't imagine being anywhere else with anyone else for the rest of my life. Silas's eyes went wet. You love me. I love you, and it terrifies me, but I am done letting fear make my decisions. I love you too. Have since you threatened to cut my coat off when I was hypothermic. Rose laughed through tears. That's when you knew. That's when I stopped lying to myself about it. Been falling since that first night you cooked. He squeezed her hand, weak but real. Don't leave. I'm not leaving. Not now. Not ever. Promise. I promise. A recovery took 2 weeks. Rose stayed in a boarding house near the stockyards, visiting Silas twice a day, watching him heal with the same maddening stubbornness he applied to everything else. Gideon recovered faster, his arm resetting well. Jed woke after 3 days and was released after a week. The cattle drive money was wired to the bank in Shadow Creek. On the 15th day, the doctor cleared Silas to travel. Take it slow, he warned. Those ribs are not fully healed. You push them, you'll be right back here. Or worse. They traveled home by wagon 5 slow days across the plains, talking about everything. The money, the ranch, the future. How they would combine the cattle drive earnings with what Rose had made to renegotiate the bank loan. How they would expand the vegetable operation in spring. How they would diversify and adapt and build something that could survive whatever came next. And they talked about the wedding. Sarah would have liked you, Silas said on the 3rd day, the wagon rocking gently beneath them. She would have loved that you used her recipe. I'm not trying to replace her. You're not replacing anyone. You're just you, Rose. And that's enough. That's more than enough. When Shadow Creek came into view on the afternoon of the 5th day, Rose started crying again. The ranch looked different. Not just clean or organized, but alive. Men working in the fields. Smoke rising from the cookhouse. New fences standing straight. The garden impossibly green. And standing in the yard, every last one of them, Walt and Caleb and Emmett and all the rest waiting. They cheered when the wagon pulled in. Caleb whooped so loud the horses spooked. Walt pulled Rose into a hug so rough and sudden that she nearly fell over. You did good, girl, he said into her hair. Real good. We all did good. No, you did good. We just followed orders. The celebration lasted into the evening. Rose cooked. Of course, she cooked a feast made from the supplies she had stockpiled and the new provisions the men had acquired while she was gone. Fried chicken, cornbread, stew, and peach cobbler made from Sarah's recipe, Evero, bite-carrying love as its secret ingredient. The joy lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th morning, another buggy rolled into Shadow Creek. Victoria Ashford again, but this time she was not alone. Beside her sat a lawyer from Denver, with a face like a closed door and a briefcase thicker than a family Bible. Mr. Hawthorne, Victoria said, her voice smooth as oiled silk, I'm not here to make an offer. I'm here to make a notification. She opened the briefcase and laid a stack of documents on the porch railing. I have purchased Shadow Creek's debt from the bank. The full $15,000. I am now your creditor. Her smile was sharp enough to draw blood. And under the terms of the purchase agreement, I have the right to demand full payment within 30 days. If you cannot pay, I foreclose. Legally and immediately. The blood drained from Silas's face. Gideon stepped forward, fists clenched, but Caleb grabbed his arm and held him back. Rose stood very still, her hand gripping the porch rail so hard her knuckles went white. Why? Rose asked, and her voice was calm in the way that deep water is calm still on the surface and full of powerful currents underneath. Why do you want this land so badly? Victoria looked at her and Rose saw it. Behind the widow's black and the marble composure, naked ambition. Not greed exactly, but something colder and more calculating. The hunger of a woman who saw the future before anyone else and intended to own it. The railroad, Rose said, answering her own question as the final piece fell into place. The new rail line being surveyed through the mountains. Shadow Creek sits directly on the route. The land will be worth 10 times its current value once the tracks go through. She turned to the lawyer. And I expect Mrs. Ashford is also behind the fraudulent tax assessments that have been bleeding this ranch dry for the past several years, inflating costs to force a sale at a fraction of the land's true worth. Victoria did not answer, but her silence was louder than any confession. Don't sign anything, Rose said to Silas. Give me 3 days. Rose. 3 days. Trust me. Silas looked at her. This girl who had arrived with a carpet bag and a cameo brooch and had somehow become the heart and spine and brain of his entire operation. He nodded. 3 days. Victoria smiled her cold smile. 3 days or 30, the result will be the same. We'll see, Rose said. And for the first time, something uncertain moved across Victoria Ashford's face. Rose did not sleep for 3 days. She went through every financial document the ranch possessed, every tax receipt, every bank statement, every piece of correspondence dating back to the year Silas's father had first purchased the land. She wrote letters to the State Banking Commission, to the Federal Railroad Survey Office, to the Denver newspaper. She compiled evidence of the fraudulent tax assessments, a paper trail that led directly to Victoria Ashford's doorstep. And then, in a box of old documents that had belonged to Josiah Hawthorne, Silas's father, buried under 20 years of dust and neglect, she found the weapon that would save them. A clause in the original land purchase contract from 1853, a priority right. It stated in language that was old-fashioned but perfectly clear that any debt secured against Shadow Creek Ranch must be offered to the current owner for purchase before it could be sold to any third party. Victoria had bought the debt directly from the bank without ever offering Silas the chance to buy it himself. The transaction was invalid. The entire purchase was legally void. When Rose laid out her findings on the dining table in front of Silas, Gideon, Caleb, Victoria, and Victoria's increasingly pale lawyer, the room went so quiet that Rose could hear the fire crackling in the kitchen stove 2 rooms away. You purchased the debt without offering Mr. Hawthorne his contractual right of first refusal. Rose set her hands steady even though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. That violates the priority clause in the original 1853 land deed. The transaction is void. The debt reverts to the original bank with whom we have already successfully negotiated new terms. Lower interest, extended deadline, June instead of March. She placed another stack of papers on the table. Additionally, I have compiled evidence that you are responsible for the fraudulent tax assessments levied against Shadow Creek over the past several years. Real estate tax fraud is a criminal offense under Colorado territorial law. I have prepared formal complaints for both the State Banking Commission and the District Attorney's Office. Victoria's lawyer, who clearly had not known about the tax fraud, went from pale to ash gray. So here is my offer, Rose said, and her voice was the calmest thing in the room. You release all claims against Shadow Creek. You reimburse every dollar of fraudulent tax that this ranch has paid, approximately $500. And you never set foot on this property again. In exchange, we don't file the complaints. The silence stretched. Wind pushed against the windows. The fire popped in the stove. Victoria Ashford looked at Rose Sinclair, 21 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, flour dust still on her apron, and understood with perfect clarity that she had been beaten. Not by money or power or connections, but by a girl with a head for numbers and a heart that would not quit. Agreed, Victoria said, and the word came out like poison leaving a wound. She stood and walked to the door, then turned back one last time. You're lucky to have her, Hawthorne. I know, Silas said, and luck had nothing to do with it. Victoria left Shadow Creek Ranch for the last time. They were married 3 weeks later in the small chapel on the hill above the ranch house. The same chapel where Silas's parents had exchanged their vows a generation ago. The same ground where Sarah was buried. A place where endings and beginnings live side by side the way they always do in places that have been loved long enough. Walt gave Rose away because she had no father. And this weathered old cowboy with his pipe and his knowing eyes had become the closest thing she had to family. Gideon stood beside Silas as best man, his scar bright in the autumn sunlight, his expression holding something Rose had never seen on his face before. Peace. Caleb stood on the other side, dimple shining eyes so wet he would deny it for the rest of his natural life. Rose wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself. Silas wore his best suit ribs, still tender, but healing. When the preacher asked if she took this man, Rose said the words without a single heartbeat of hesitation. When he asked Silas, his voice was steady as bedrock. I do. They kissed to cheers and whistles from every cowboy on the ranch, and then there was a feast, because there was always a feast when Rose Sinclair was involved. Fried chicken and cornbread and stew and cobbler made from Sarah's recipe. Someone produced a fiddle. There was dancing in the yard under stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. Silas pulled Rose aside as the music played on. Happy. Terrified, but happy. Good terrified or bad terrified? Good terrified. The kind that means I finally care about something enough to be scared of losing it. He kissed her forehead, gentle as the first time he had done it on the porch under the stars a lifetime ago. You're not losing this. You're not losing me. We're building something that lasts. The door closed softly behind them that night. When morning came, everything between them had changed deep and permanent and beautiful, in the way that only two people who have known real loss can understand. The first year was hard. They paid down the bank loan, but did not clear it entirely. Built the vegetable operation into something steady, but not wealthy. Lost cattle to weather and bad luck, but not enough to break them. Made mistakes, fixed them, and learned. The second year, they turned a profit. Not a fortune, but enough. The bank stopped circling. Victoria Ashford sold her ranch to a railroad company and moved to Denver without looking back. The cattle market improved. The garden flourished. The smokehouse produced enough cured meat to supply 3 towns. Silas announced, as he had promised, that Shadow Creek was a partnership in spirit if not in law. "This isn't my ranch anymore," he told the men gathered in the dining room on a Sunday evening. "It's ours. What we build together. What we earn, we share." Gideon, who had arrived at this table 3 years ago, burning with anger and fear, stood and raised his coffee cup. "To Shadow Creek." "To Shadow Creek," the men echoed. And Caleb, grinning his impossible grin, added, "To the best mail-order bride advertisement ever written." The laughter that filled that room was the sound of men who had remembered how to live. By the third year, Rose was pregnant. She stood in the kitchen she had scrubbed back to life, hand resting on the swell of her belly, and felt fear and hope mixing in equal measure the way they always did when something precious was at stake. "What if something happens?" she asked Silas one evening, and he heard in those 4 words every loss she had ever suffered, every child who had died in her family, every reason she had spent 3 years running from anything that could be taken away. "What if nothing happens?" he answered. "What if everything goes exactly right?" "That's not how life works." "No, but it's how faith works." He knelt beside her, this enormous man, 6 feet, 6 inches of mountain and muscle and stubbornness, kneeling on a kitchen floor that his first wife had designed and his second wife had saved. "You taught me that, Rose. You taught me that caring about something means accepting the risk, that staying means facing the fear, that building something worthwhile requires believing it won't all fall apart." "I'm scared." "Me too, but we're scared together, and that makes it bearable." Their daughter was born in the spring, healthy and strong, with her mother's determination and her father's stubbornness and a cry loud enough to be heard in the bunkhouse. They named her Sarah Grace. Sarah for the wife who had taught Silas what love was. Grace for the sister Rose had lost, whose memory she would carry gently now instead of running from it. And Grace because Grace was what had brought them together, unearned and undeserved and more beautiful for being both. Rose held her daughter in the kitchen, where everything had started, and felt the circle close. She had come to Shadow Creek answering an advertisement she found in a newspaper placed by a young man too desperate to wait for his brother's permission. She had stayed because a promise made to a stubborn rancher had become a promise made to herself. She had fought because fighting was the only honest response to a world that kept trying to take things away. And she had built board by board and meal by meal and day by day something she had not believed she would ever have again. A home. "Thank you," she whispered to the baby sleeping in her arms. "For what?" Silas asked from the doorway, leaning against the frame the way he had that first evening when he had walked into a clean kitchen and found a stranger who had turned his dead house back into a living one. "For being alive. For being here. For giving me a reason to stay." Silas crossed the room and wrapped his arms around his wife and daughter. Outside the ranch breathed with the rhythm of work and life and purpose. Cowboys laughing, cattle lowing in the fields, the garden growing green and wild behind the cookhouse, smoke rising from the chimney, the mountains standing guard on 3 sides, white and permanent and patient. Shadow Creek Ranch had been dying when Rose Sinclair arrived with a leather trunk and a cameo brooch and a terror of staying anywhere long enough to be hurt. It had been saved by fried chicken and stubbornness and love. But more than that, it had been saved by people who decided that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible, worth staying for, even when running was easier, worth building, even when everything might fall apart. And Rose, standing in that kitchen, holding her daughter, surrounded by the life she had built from flour and faith, and the refusal to give up, finally understood what home meant. Not a place you find, a place you fight for, a place you earn with your own 2 hands, a place you refuse to abandon no matter how scared you are. Shadow Creek Ranch, with its kitchen that had been dead and now was alive, its loyal men, its three mountain brothers, and its mail-order bride who had learned the hardest lesson of all, how to stay, was finally completely and undeniably home.